As Pinsent Masons is a global firm, we work on about 500 breaches a year. I would love to see that number go down every year, but it tends not to. So it's about 500 breaches a year that we get involved in. And we publish an annual report in terms of what we see from those breaches. I will caveat these stats with, these are the ones that we work on. So most of our breaches come through insurance panels. So they're normally from larger companies that tend to have cyber insurance, or they are kind of that large enterprise direct client. So conscious that it doesn't necessarily translate directly to SMEs, but for what it's worth, these are our facts and figures. 5% of these, this is a kind of sector agnostic stats, 5% of them are legal sector specific. But if we do break them down, there's actually not a huge amount of difference between the different sectors in terms of the stuff that I'll be covering. So I want to first look at kind of the regulatory notification trends, and I'm talking specifically around ICO notifications, so UK ICO notifications. So post-breach, in 2021, 72% of organizations were notifying the ICO. In 2022, that dropped to 64%, and last year that dropped to 56%. So a pretty significant drop in terms of the number of notifications that have gone to the ICO in 2 years' time, which is pretty drastic. The optimist in me thinks that that's because people are now kind of getting more familiar with them. They understand what they need to tell the regulators. They understand when they need to report stuff and when they don't. The pessimist in me thinks that people are probably avoiding sometimes reporting to the ICO when they should, and there's definitely been a noticeable lack of action from the ICO in certain cases, and I think businesses have definitely noticed that. And so there's been incidents that I've been involved in where we have given very strong advice that they probably should be notifying, but ultimately that's up to them to do. So I think a few reasons why that number has changed so much. Show of hands, who's been involved in the actual notification process with an ICO? So how many of you have actually worked with the ICO in terms of answering questions after a breach? Handful of people, perfect. So normally what happens when you report a breach to the ICO is there's a pretty standard form, you fill that in, someone will review it, and they come back to you with more questions normally. Those questions are very much dependent on how much information you give them at the initial point of report. In 2022, 5% of our cases were getting over 50 questions, which is quite a lot to come back from the ICO. And bear in mind, this is all standard reporting, so it's the same amount of information that we've given them in every report, but they've been very different in terms of the questions that they've come back with. This past year, 2023, our average report got 1 to 10 questions, so there's been a massive decline in the amount of questions that they come back with. There's very much a theme, so they'll normally ask about the data subjects, who's been affected, they'll ask about the types of data, and then they normally want to know a bit more about the incident. So normally when you report to the ICO, it's in the immediate aftermath of a breach, and you don't know a huge amount about actually what happened. So they tend to be things like, do you know what threat actor was behind the attack? Do you know what data was compromised? Do you know if it's been sold? Do you know if any other jurisdictions were affected? So it's those sorts of questions. We are also seeing the average time for the ICO to close reports is decreasing, which is great news. So if you're a company who's had to submit a report to the ICO, you are in limbo while they're reviewing it. So you have to wait until they come back to tell you if you're going to be fined, if there's a kind of warning that they'll issue you. So you kind of sit in limbo, and it's this horrible thing hanging over your head just waiting for them to come back. In 2021, 50% of cases were taking 50 to 100 days. That's a really long time to have that hanging over your head. As I said, there's been some issues with the ICO in terms of their enforcement in the past, and I think they've been very aware of that. In 2023, 40% are now taking under 10 days. So there's been a significant increase in terms of how they've been able to close those reports. I think they have made a significant increase in terms of hiring experienced staff that understand the types of reports they're reviewing and how to respond to those. But businesses are also becoming more familiar with what information needs to be provided, and that's stuff that we can help with as a law firm. But unfortunately, I think companies are just more familiar with being breached and understand what they need to do now. So if we talk briefly, and I'll come back to kind of why the regulatory notification stuff matters, but if we talk about the types of breaches that we tend to get involved in, 58% of those are ransomware. That's pretty much an industry standard. 43% have data exfiltration. So historically, ransomware would encrypt your files but leave them on your system. Now we tend to see a kind of double extortion. So they will encrypt the files on your system, but they'll also take copies so that they can release it and sell it if you don't pay. So it's a kind of a double whammy. 35% of those incidents, so ransomware and data exfiltration and all of the other types of incidents we have, 35% are the result of a third-party issue. And I realize that that's a very broad scope of things, but supply chain, third-party risk, that's a really, really common topic that everyone is talking about right now. The second cause, root cause behind third-party attacks was vulnerabilities and configuration issues. So you've got something in your system where there was a vulnerability, or you've installed something and didn't know how to configure it, and so there's been a gap that's left. And then third is phishing emails, everyone's favorite thing to talk about. So none of these are new risks. We're all really aware that third-party risk is really complex and it's really dangerous. We know that vulnerabilities are a regular thing that IT teams have to deal with, and we know that phishing emails still tend to be successful, so people are going to keep sending them. And security vendors know this, and this isn't kind of a software bashing thing. We absolutely need security tooling, but they're really aware that this is a problem. And so if you go to any security conference, there's a million AI-backed risk management tools that will revolutionize your lives. And we tend, in our roles, we tend to talk about supply chain risk as this kind of homogenous threat. So you need to be really careful about the companies that you use, the partners you use. And there's a few different types of vulnerabilities that people can actually attack you via your third parties. So it could be someone poisons an update. So you have an update that's sent from the vendor. SolarWinds is the really famous example of this. So they poisoned the update was pushed out to all of their customers, and then they were compromised. It could be a vulnerability in the software. So something just wasn't built properly, and so because you have the tool in your environment, you are then vulnerable from it. And then the last one is that they have access to your systems a lot of times. So if you have a third-party developer teams is one of the really common ones we see. You have external developers and they need to access your corporate environment. It could be HR systems that you have plugged in. It could be tooling that needs an admin account to be able to run reports every night. There's loads of really, really common third-party software that's plugged in and isn't monitored and isn't tracked. So those tend to be the three main types of third-party vulnerabilities when we talk about it as an overall thing. I'm going to take a few points. So the British Library, if you're not familiar with it, the British Library were hit by quite a big ransomware attack last year. And they deserve huge kudos, I think, for their report afterwards. So they released a postmortem. If you're at all interested in it, it is really, really fascinating reading. They've been very open about their vulnerabilities. They were very open about the entire situation and what happened. It is a great read. And I'm just going to pull out some kind of learnings and some lessons from their postmortem about what can be learned from this. They say in the report that they did have secure backups. So one of the things we say to defend against ransomware, the best thing that you can do is have secure backups. They had those, but their infrastructure was so old that it couldn't handle rebuilding. So they had the backups, they did the right thing, but their existing systems couldn't cope with it. They also go on to say in the report that major software systems couldn't be brought back to life because they were either out of support from the vendor, so they were so old that the vendor didn't release it anymore, or they didn't operate on the new platforms that they put in place. So as they brought in new infrastructure, the platforms, the apps that they were using were so old that they couldn't run them on the new platform. The poll that went on earlier, a third of people in here have legacy technology problems. I think that's probably low. It is a really, really common problem. And I know from a security person perspective, we love to get on stage and say, just patch everything, just update everything, don't have legacy systems. But that's not real life. And ultimately, businesses have legacy systems. And it just isn't feasible to rip everything out and replace it just because there's a vulnerability that you may or may not be attacked through. So they have a direct quote from this, and just sorry for looking down and reading. The historically complex shape of the network allowed attackers wider access than would have been possible in a more modern network design. The resilience on older applications and manual processes to pass data from one system to another increased the volume of staff and customer data held in multiple places across the network. That could be from pretty much any company that I've ever worked in. That is a really, really common problem. And so, again, kudos to them for putting that out there, because people like to pretend that they don't have that, and it's a bit of a dirty secret that there's manual processes in the background. Every single business struggles with that. Just to pull out another couple of points, they had firewalls, they had antivirus EDR on their laptops, and it worked. It stopped the infection from infecting laptops. They were able to stop a lot of movement with firewalls. So the technology did work as far as it was installed. They didn't have MFA rolled out, so multi-factor authentication wasn't rolled out everywhere. And then the really important thing is they say that they flagged third-party access as a risk to their compliance board in 2022. So they knew that this was a risk. It was documented. Senior management were well aware of it. There was actually a review and budget allocated for a project starting in 2024. And this is a really, really common thing, is I don't think people bury their heads in the sand and they aren't aware of the challenges and they're not aware of the risks. But ultimately, you have to decide, budgets are finite, and you have to decide where they go. And so how do you decide what's a risk and what's worth the budget spend and what isn't? So to come back to those kind of root causes, third-party issues, phishing emails, vulnerabilities and misconfigurations, as I said, those are sector agnostic. They're nothing new. The motivation behind the criminals perpetuating the attacks may be different. So someone attacking a legal sector firm might be different to someone who wants to attack the British Library. But ultimately, the way in is exactly the same. And I don't see that really changing anytime soon. But I know that supply chain attacks is really kind of a hot topic right now, and most conferences will have something about it. It's nothing new. So Target breach, anyone familiar with Target in the US? They're one of the biggest retailers in the US. They had a breach 10 years ago. So they have, they sell everything, but amongst everything they sell, they have like refrigerator coolers at the end of every till, and so you can buy a drink on your way to the cash register. The company who has sensors to monitor the cooling temperature, their HVAC company, was hacked. And from that, they were able to move from the sensors monitoring how cold the drinks are through to the tills, because they were plugged into the same network. And then they were able to compromise the credit card machines. And this was in November. So leading right up to Christmas, one of the biggest retailers in the US. This was after all the Black Friday sales. They had millions of people's credit card details, payment information, all of that. That was 10 years ago. So we know, like, this is not going away. We know that this is a problem. Where we really see it affecting sectors specifically, and again, you could see from some of the questions earlier, is when it's proprietary kind of industry-specific software. So you get it a lot in OT environments, so operational technology, manufacturing plants, any of the kind of public sector services. There's only a handful of companies who tend to make a lot of the tooling that they use. And so you know that if you can compromise one of those vendors, you're probably going to attack about a third of critical national infrastructure around the world. Similar in the legal sector, there's a lot of software that every law firm will use, and so you know if you can compromise that, you can compromise most law firms. So proprietary software and hardware is really, I think, one of the vulnerabilities where people need to be aware. Just because every other firm uses it, it doesn't mean it's necessarily safe to just let it run rampant in your environment. And so that brings me on to the kind of so what of things. I know that security people tend to talk a lot about doom and gloom and everything is horrible. And I don't want to be one of those people. And I also don't want to stand here and pretend like it's easy. Just patch everything, just upgrade. It's not easy, because if it was, I'd be out of a job. These are huge challenges. They are expensive, they are complex, but they remain the best defenses that you can put in place against these attacks. So if we look at where to focus budget and investment, how do you prioritize those things? And you could hear from the British Library attack, they knew that this was a problem. They had other more pressing things to put the budget towards. Going back to the ICO notifications, I really, really encourage you, as you're going through your budget planning cycles, especially around IT and security spend, document those decisions. If you aren't sure if budget's going to be reallocated and you're not able to get the thing that you've been pushing for 3 years, make sure that that's documented, because the ICO very much want to see, you don't need to have kind of enterprise grade security. They're not fussed about what you have in place, they're fussed about why you have it. So you need to be able to justify. It may have been the wrong decision, but if you can show that there was data behind it and you can show that there was kind of best efforts, they're normally pretty understanding about that. So it's really, really important that there's a very clear paper trail around investment decisions in security. And that brings me on to threat modeling and threat intelligence. So these aren't new, they're not revolutionary concepts, and a lot of non-security people kind of think of it as very much a super technical thing. I think it is the most important thing missing from conversations when you're talking to leadership, when you're talking to the board. Good threat intelligence absolutely is a crucial factor. So you need to understand who you're at risk from. You need to understand why you're at risk from them. Do you operate in certain regions that might make you more of a target? Are you well known for litigations? Do you have a certain client that might be a political hot button and you might be targeted by hacktivists? It's really important to understand your specific threats. You can do a bit to say, right, there's increased activity in the legal sector, so it's kind of shields up and we know that we need to be aware. But ultimately, most, and some are very targeted, but most cyber attacks are crimes of opportunity. It's low-hanging fruit. From a criminal perspective, if you don't have to put in the effort, you're not going to. And unfortunately, phishing emails are pretty easy to write. They're pretty low effort to send. And so those low-tech, low-effort things tend to be really successful. So they don't put the effort in if they don't have to. If you can kind of address the basics, raise the shields as much as you can, but then to mature it, taking a look at actually your specific threats. Why are you a target versus the person down the road? All of that then, so that threat intelligence will then feed into your threat modeling. So it's really important to say, in a scenario, threat modeling, you would say, right, what if our CEO left his laptop on a plane? What happens? And you map out all of the possible options from that. What happens if someone's phone got stolen and they were logged in and they had their 2FA codes? Okay, let's play this out. What's the worst case scenario? So really going through and understanding, these are our biggest threats. This is the impact to the business. And then you can start to use that to allocate budget and look at where you're focused. Headcount, priorities, resources, and stuff like that. As I said, that decision part of the conversation, I think, is just crucial to have documented. And hindsight is 2020, and I'm sure the British Library now wishes that they maybe brought forward their third-party risk strategy. But it happens, and sometimes you get the calls wrong. But it's just really important to have it really clearly documented why you made those decisions, because, again, the regulator looks much more favorably upon that. So what are some of the other things that you should be focused on or could be focused on? First thing, legacy equals risk. And again, I'll come back to the poll that was put up there. A third of people say that legacy systems are a problem for them. It isn't realistic to say that everyone's just going to migrate things overnight. And so it's really important to understand what legacy processes and systems you have. Modernize where you can, of course, but where you can't, it's really important to monitor, and keep an eye on those things. Another quote from the British Library report, the library had very modern tools in place, but they were not able to completely monitor or protect our network due to its legacy topology. So again, they had the right tooling, they had the right stuff, but it was just an old network, and so they couldn't apply the new tools to some of the legacy areas. So monitor what you can't protect. If you have certain things that need admin accounts, they need permissions, limit them as much as you can. I know it's not the most exciting thing to talk about, but it is one of the most valuable things you can do. Secondly, make sure that you have an IR retainer, so incident response retainer. It's likely included if you have cyber insurance, but it's not always. The best time to check that is now. The second best time is not after a breach. So it's really, really important that you understand in your business what your cyber insurance covers, and if it doesn't, make sure that you have an incident response team on retainer. They can help even companies that have huge in-house resources in the immediate aftermath of a breach. Having someone external to be able to come in and run things, to keep a clear head, to be non-biased, agnostic to things is super, super important. And they live and breathe it. They know exactly what they're doing all the time. They are worth their weight in gold. Just for bias sake, I don't do incident response, so I'm not trying to sell anything. Next one, start where you can. So MFA, multi-factor authentication, and network segmentation. I'm not going to stand here and pretend like these are super easy to do. But again, if you know that you have a business critical system, isolate it, try and limit its access in your network, limit the permissions that it has across your network, put MFA on anything that is internet facing if you can, and then increase your monitoring and alerting. So it will be a race against time, and there's a lot of what we do in security, which is let's cross our fingers and hope we get there before they do, but it works sometimes. So if you kind of work on the things that you can address, fix the low-hanging fruit. The next thing is practice. Breaches are a fact of life, unfortunately. And so really make sure that your business continuity plans and your disaster recovery plans are documented, they're tested, that they're available offline, so that if you lose access to your systems, you know who to contact, you still have people's contact details, you have processes written down, and make sure that you are doing full tabletop exercises annually. Again, I think it is just one of the most valuable things you can do with an exec team. Make sure you have legal, PR, comms, HR, operations. It should be a multidisciplinary tabletop exercise. It can go for a whole day, which I know is a big ask to get people to take a full day, but it's well worth it. It becomes like muscle memory, and there's a lot of research that's been done about the emotional and stress toll on people after an incident. If you are familiar and if you've done tabletop exercises, that stress that's imparted from an incident drops down to next to nothing. People know exactly what's expected of them. They know what's going to happen in the business. Communications are fine. It lowers the stress for everyone involved. Make sure that people in the business understand the business impact of cyber risk. And again, I know that this is easier for me to stand up here and say than it is to be done. But IT security risks that exist at an operational level have to be flagged with senior management. There needs to be a holistic view of it. So I think a lot of times people in security will look at things in isolation, especially if they're low risk. Cyber should be looked at as an aggregate risk across your business. So you really need to understand all of your different vulnerabilities, add it up together. What does that mean for you? So make sure that that is a regular board conversation. I've been a consultant for quite a few years now, and I have lost track the amount of times that I have been in organizations and they say, oh, well, cyber presents to the board once a year. That's not a very good idea. So it doesn't need to be a constant thing. I don't think there's probably loads of cyber people I know who would kind of fight to be in a board meeting every time there is one. But it should be a regular conversation. Quarterly is a nice cadence, whatever works for you guys. But make sure that it becomes a regular topic with senior management. Ask around. If you're in senior management and you don't feel like you have a good understanding of these things that are facing your business, bring in people from your IT and security team, because it really is important that there's a clear understanding. My final point is stop trying to be secure. And again, as someone who wants everyone to be secure and sells my services to help people be secure, we need to shift the conversation, because security, 100% security, is not possible. If you have an internet connected system, it is vulnerable. And so there's a lot of people who will spend billions on trying to be secure, and they forget about being resilient, and they forget about being able to recover quickly. And I think it might feel a bit defeatist to say that you're kind of planning for an attack and you're planning to fail, but it happens every day. And so I think it's really, really important to focus on that resiliency and recovery more than it is to focus on just being secure. So any investment in security should be balanced against investment in backup and recovery capabilities. Again, from the British Library post-mortem, they very clearly, they had the right stuff in place, but they didn't have the systems to be able to recover. You can see from regulations across the UK and the EU, there's an increased drive in resiliency. So NIS2 is obviously the big one, and that is all about the resiliency of organizations. DORA is another one. Breaches happen, and I think lawmakers are well aware of that, and so it's very much about actually how quickly can you recover, how much of an impact is it to your customers. So make sure that they're joint conversations. And yeah, I think ultimately it is a challenge, and I think looking at things from a specific sector or from a specific company size or something like that, I think that gives you a very small lens on what your threats are. So I just really encourage you, as kind of takeaways from this, understand what threats face you specifically as a business. I mean, you don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel. Some threats will be the same across everyone, but understand what's specific to you, and really use that to tailor security to your organization to make it more effective. And that's it. Thank you.